The NBA has had a bad contract problem for a while. This is something that, especially over the last 10 years in the league, we've just seen a ton of guys get huge contracts, a ton of money, and completely underperform or get hurt. And these teams are paying a ton of money to guys that are not helping their team at all. But recently, the NBA might have actually fixed this problem. So when you think about some of the worst contracts in the league right now, some things that come to mind for me personally, the Ben Simmons contract is terrible, although it's expiring soon. Cam Johnson for the Nets, also pretty terrible. You're paying a ton of money to a role player guy, basically, who's not really doing much for your team. And then in more recent years, like, wasn't a huge fan of the Rudy Gobert contract. The Tobias Harris contract, although now it's expiring, has been a big one that people like to point out as well. And basically, these are all just examples of giving a ton of money to players that are underperforming, which obviously is a gigantic issue in a league that has a salary cap. You're giving away a percentage of the amount of money that you're allowed to spend on your team to a guy that is not actually helping you. And this was particularly bad. This really reached its height, its apex in the summer of 2016. When you go back to when the league salary cap rose randomly not randomly, but suddenly, I should say, for a year in 2016, all these guys were getting huge deals because suddenly the entire league had an excess of salary cap space. So it just increased the player value of the contract. We're talking about, role player centers like Ian Mahinmi getting almost $20 million a year. Of course, this allowed Kevin Durant to go to the Warriors that year. That wasn't a bad contract, but it's just an example of how ludicrous the salary cap spike was in the summer of 2016. And then for the years after that, 2016 to 2020, that was really the height of the bad contracts in the NBA. There were all these guys that were on huge deals that got moved around to all these different teams, attaching picks, just trying to get rid of this money. And it really was a significant issue for the league. They were teams that were completely out of trying to spend on free agency because they had some of these huge contracts from 2016 and 2017, not to mention some teams like the Wizards that just got bad luck where they signed John Wall to the Supermax contract after he made an All-NBA team, and then immediately after he got hurt, it was just not worth that deal at all. But when you look around the league right now and you try and figure out what some of the worst bad contracts are, there really aren't nearly as many as you would think that there would be. And there's a couple of different reasons for this. I think generally speaking, teams have gotten smarter about how they spend, about their understanding of the salary cap over the last half decade or so. There's been more of a movement towards having, a dedicated salary cap guy in the front office that tells you, hey, this is a good idea, this isn't a good idea, here's what our long-term plan is. I just think teams have gotten better and smarter after kind of the disasters of 2016 and 2017 about where they spend their free agency money. And collectively, when the league gets smarter, there's just less of these bad contracts out there because there's less inflated prices. There's not teams, competing to give out bad contracts to a couple of different players that then allows that contract to actually happen. And generally speaking, I just think teams have gotten better at team building through free agency over the last handful of seasons. The other thing that's happening here is when teams do give out a big contract, it's mostly to, like, if it's a risk, at least it's a risk that makes sense, right? So it's to a young player that's up and coming that will probably be worth the deal, but even if they're not, they should still be at least good, right? So like Michael Porter Jr., I think, is a great example of this. The risk for him when they gave him basically a max contract was the injury concern and then seeing, how high he could really elevate his game, but at least he was a young player. And we've seen that with pretty much every player now that comes in and is like borderline all-star caliber guy. You're going to get a max contract rookie extension. And that's been a big theme over the last couple of seasons. We're talking about LaMelo Ball. We're talking about just everybody, right? All these guys get these big contracts. And people have kind of talked about this as potentially an issue because there's no middle ground anymore. Like the first Jaylen Brown contract, not the most recent one, but the first one was not a max contract. And that like never happens anymore. If you're a really good player on a rookie contract, you basically always get something close to a max at least. And that doesn't really happen anymore, but at least it's on a player that it makes sense. They are young, they are up and coming, right? But the other part of this is, and I think maybe this is the biggest part of all of this in terms of not having bad contracts, is yes, we've gotten smarter. Yes, maybe they're taking better risks, but the salary cap also just continues to increase by a ton every season. And it's really difficult to have a truly bad contract when you sign a guy because all these contracts are based off of a percentage of the salary cap, right? So like in a given year, a max contract 1 year to the next means different things in terms of how much money it is. It's the same percentage, but if the cap goes up, it's more money, right? So in a given year, let's say you're giving out a rookie max extension, it's worth 25% of the salary cap. Well, 25% of the salary cap in 2016 compared to 25% of the salary cap in 2020 or 2024 is completely different. And that has been something that has kind of saved a lot of these teams and made them even more willing to go out and give some of these rookie max contracts, or just generally speaking, max contracts out to these players. Because even if you give, for example, the Rockets giving Fred VanVleet a ton of money, it was a ton of money, but in a year year or two, the cap is just going to continue to rise. And then it's not really a max contract anymore. So giving someone 25% of the salary cap in one season is basically like 2 years from then giving them 20% of the salary cap in a different season, because it just continues to rise. And it's interesting how all these factors together have not necessarily eliminated the bad contract issue in the NBA. I still think that there are some that are definitely questionable around the league, which is always going to be the case because of injuries and because of underperforming players and because of a salary cap focused league. But it's interesting how all these things have come together and really not completely gotten rid of the problem, but kind of solved it at the same time. And generally speaking, that's good for the league. It's good for the league when guys that are getting paid a ton of money are actually helping their teams and are actually worth those numbers. There are still some deals around the league that I think teams know that they're paying too much. I think the Warriors know they're paying Andrew Wiggins too much. I think the Celtics know they're paying Jaylen Brown too much. But kind of those situations are just, they wanted to retain the guy, right? The Warriors are coming off winning a title. They want to keep Andrew Wiggins. He was awesome in the finals. They signed him to a big deal. Jaylen Brown is critical to what Boston does. He's not worth $300 million, but they didn't want to just lose him and they didn't want to trade him. So they ended up keeping him. And a lot of that stuff does come into play. And I think moving forward into the future for the league, there's just going to be less of these bad contracts. As long as the cap continues to go up, we're probably not going to see a ton more like Davis Bertans, getting $100 million. We're probably not going to see a ton of Ian Mahinmi getting $20 million a year, whatever the equivalent of that would be as the salary continues to rise. Because teams are smarter, the cap's going to continue to go up, and generally speaking, they're just not giving out those kinds of deals anymore. If it's going to be a bad contract moving forward in the future, it's going to be one of two things. One, it's going to be a guy that just like doesn't play, refuses to play, or whatever the case may be is happening with someone like Ben Simmons, for example, that like was really good and then just becomes a complete zero and is making $40 million a year. Or it's going to be a rookie contract guy that got a max and then got hurt or just wasn't particularly good, right? Like I think DeAndre Ayton is an interesting example moving forward in Portland because he's on a big number, but maybe doesn't help you win a ton of games. Those kinds of contracts are kind of going to always be out there, but it's really interesting to me because when I first started really covering a lot of the NBA stuff on this channel, bad contracts were a huge part of the league, trying to get off of them, trying to stretch them, they literally put in stuff into the CBA to make it easier for teams to get out of these big deals, at least on the salary cap, because of how bad it got. And it was a big part of team building, was making sure you didn't have bad contracts and how to get rid of them and having expiring contracts and moving space around and not having as much, stuff on your salary to try and create opportunities for yourself in free agency. And the league has really moved away from that kind of stuff in favor of, trades and draft and things like that. The league is built less through free agency now, certainly than it was, 5 to 8 years ago. And it's really interesting to me how all these factors have just kind of combined together to create this situation. And really, I think that the biggest thing that could change this and maybe prevent this from continuing to be a trend in the future would be if the cap didn't continue to rise the way that it has, because teams are definitely counting on that. Like when teams are giving out big numbers, they're assuming that the cap is going to be higher in 2 or 3 years. And the reason the cap goes up is because league revenue continues to go up. And at this point, there's no reason to believe it won't continue to go up. The league is going to expand here in the next couple of seasons, and revenue should continue to go up. The new TV deal continues to just go up and up and up. That's what caused the salary cap spike in 2016 in the first place. But if for whatever reason, new rules come into place or the revenue split changes or however they make it work within the CBA, if the salary cap at some point does start to level off and we don't have a continual increase year after year after year, then we could start to see some of these bad contracts come in, because in theory, some of these numbers that teams are giving out to players aren't a good idea and are bad contracts. And then they're just getting saved by the salary cap continuing to increase, which teams are aware of and teams know that the cap's going to continue to increase. But that's really the only thing I think that could bring back in bad contracts, with the exception of, some of those random guy gets hurt, guy just severely underperforms kinds of things. But the days of like bad 2016, 2017 contracts are probably over.